Hi, I'm Ixta Belfrage and I'm here at the Food52 Kitchen making my favorite recipe, my prawn and habanero lasagna from my book Mezcla. First, we're gonna get going with the prawns. So the prawn ragu is made up of chopped prawns. I'm just gonna make a really quick stock with the prawn heads and shells. You can absolutely start with shelled prawns and use shop-bought stock or water instead if you wanna make it really quick. But I've got these lovely shelled prawns, so I'm gonna make a stock quickly myself. If you are using shell-on prawns, you just need to clean them and take, I don't know, whatever you wanna call it. Some people call it a tract, some call it a poop shoot, whatever you wanna call it. Just take that out. And then we're gonna chop them up into small little pieces like that. Mezcla is all about fusion cooking and specifically about 3 countries that really inspired the way I cook. 3 cuisines that I grew up with, so Brazilian, Mexican, and Italian. And this dish is like a perfect representation of that because in its first incarnation, it was a little bit Brazilian, a little bit Mexican, and a little bit Italian. So obviously lasagna is Italian. The Mexican element comes from the chipotle and habanero chilies. And then in the first few versions of the recipe, instead of a bechamel, I made something called catupiry or requeijão, which is like a Brazilian cheese sauce. And I use that instead of bechamel. In this version, I've like simplified it quite a lot. So there's no requeijão, no catupiry, no bechamel. It's just cream and cheese, but it's still just a really good representation of mezcla, which means mix or blend, and of fusion cooking, which I love to do. So since I'm making a stock, I'm gonna stick all the heads and shells into a pan. I've got some old bits of parsley and leek and like celery tops that I had in the fridge, so I'm gonna chuck those in. You can chuck bits of carrot in, bits of onion, whatever you want. And then I'm covering it with stock. This is chicken stock and this is obviously prawn heads, so that's gonna make it extra delicious, but you can use water. So I'm just gonna bring that up to a simmer and then stick it aside while I make the rest of the ragu. So while the stock's going, I'm gonna prep the base for the ragu, which is chopped garlic and chopped onions, which I've done already, and then some chopped cherry tomatoes. So really try and make sure that you're using super ripe, sweet cherry tomatoes. I like to use Dattarini tomatoes. It'll cook down and become this like beautiful, luxurious sauce. I'm using these fresh, ripe cherry tomatoes. I'm also gonna use tomato paste. So it's gonna be quite a tomatoey ragu, which I like. And it's gonna have that sort of different elements of tomato. So the more fresh tomato and then the more concentrated paste or puree or whatever you guys call it here. So I'm gonna start off with plenty of oil, about 4 tablespoons. There'll be more oil later. This is a pretty oily ragu. I do like a lot of olive oil. And just let that heat up a little bit. So I know this might upset quite a lot of people, but I'm gonna put these tomatoes, onions, and garlic in all at the same time. I'm a big believer that there are no rules when it comes to cooking, and I know that most people would start off by frying the onion and get that sort of golden, and then add the garlic, and then add the tomato, but I'm pretty lazy, and I like to cut corners. So I like to put things all in at the same time, and trust me, it works. This is my most popular recipe ever. And I always make ragus like this. I just put it all in. As long as you kind of like start on a medium heat and just let it cook all together. And you're gonna just keep cooking it until the onions are soft and golden, until the tomatoes are cooked down, until the garlic's also soft and golden. I've tested this recipe enough times to know that like there's not too much in the pan that it's just gonna sweat and not become nice and golden. So just don't worry about it. This is kind of at the stage I want it. It's all nice and reduced. The oil is kind of starting to split. The onions are soft and golden and you can kind of crush them with the back of a spoon. So prawns are going in and I've turned the heat up. I've got the prawns in. They're gonna sort of start releasing a bit of liquid and then that liquid will reabsorb and then we'll be able to color them. So they'll get nice and pink and then they'll get nice and sort of golden brown. So we are ready for the next step. You can kind of hear this crackling. You've got some nice sort of caramelized color on the prawns. So we're gonna start adding the next ingredients. So I've got some tomato paste or puree, I'm not sure what you call it here, concentrated tomato. So we're gonna add some miso, which might seem a bit weird, but just gives it a really, really lovely, sweet, salty depth of flavor. And here's where the first Mexican element comes in. We're gonna add a habanero chili, which is like one of my favorite chilies. This is a dried one. So just gonna chuck it in and don't worry about it. It is one of the hottest chilies, but we're gonna keep it whole. So it will soften in the sauce as it cooks. And you can kind of just keep tasting the sauce and take it out when it's at your level of spice. I actually like to keep it in there until it's super soft, chop it up and then add it back to the ragu at the end, but it's totally your call. Next, we're gonna add loads of pepper, and I really mean a lot of pepper. So I'm gonna go with about 50 twists. So this is gonna take a while. So that's about 50, I'm gonna stop now. Give that a nice mix. So the reason I love Mexican chilies and Mexican food in general is because I spent a lot of time there with my family. My granddad lived there for about 30 years, and my parents met there. My name is Mexican, so I'm not Mexican by blood at all, but I do feel I have this sort of very strong connection. My mum is Brazilian, so I grew up eating a lot of Brazilian food, and I actually grew up in Italy, so that's where the Italian connection comes in. I'm not Italian, so I'm not Mexican or Italian, but I am half Brazilian, and all that is just to say that Italian, Mexican, and Brazilian food is the kind of food that I grew up with. So all of these ingredients, it was just like natural for me to mix them together because that's what was around and what I grew up with. So to me, it's not really that weird. People always like, oh, Mexican, Brazilian, and Italian, how does that work? Well, this is how it works. Now that that tomato paste is cooked down, I'm gonna add some wine and just let that bubble away. Now I'm gonna add the stock. Just strain it straight in, that's the easiest way. And then I'm gonna let that simmer away until it's kind of like thickened into a beautiful ragu. I'm also just gonna squash this habanero a little bit to release that flavor. You don't need to do that if you don't like spice too much. I love hot heat, so I like to squash it in as I go. So bring this to a simmer, and once it's simmering, turn the heat down to low. So while that's simmering away, I'm just gonna make the habanero oil. So get your oil in a small pan with some tomato paste, some paprika or paprika, I don't really ever know how to say it, chipotle, and a chopped up habanero. Again, you don't have to do this. If you don't like spice, just add less or don't add it. But I mean, it is supposed to be a habanero oil, so you do you. I've got that all mixed up in here, and then I'm just gonna heat it up until it starts to bubble, and that's pretty much it. Oh yeah, I'm just gonna add a bit of salt. So it is time to assemble the lasagna, my favorite part. I am going today for a small and tall dish. You could also go for a wider one and it won't be as tall. I just like quite like a tall slice. Okay, so I'm gonna start by covering the bottom with the lasagna sheet. I'm using fresh lasagna because I prefer it and also it'll cook quicker. And I'm just gonna cover it with a nice layer of this ragu. And it might look a little sort of watery now, but it'll thicken up in the oven. And now I'm gonna go in with my bechamel replacement. So I'm not using a bechamel for this. I don't really like really bechamel-y lasagnas. I prefer them a little bit drier. So I'm just going with a nice spoonful of cream and then a sprinkling of Parmesan. Now I'm going in with a drizzle of that habanero oil. And finally, some chives. And then I'm just gonna keep layering up. So now I'm just gonna cover this and I'm gonna put it into an oven that I've preheated to about 395, 400. We're just gonna cook that for about 20 minutes and then take the foil off and let it get nice and crispy on top. And there we go. She's a little bit burnt on the top, but that's absolutely fine. So now I'm just gonna do the finishing touches. So a little bit more cream on top. Not that it's really necessary, but it looks pretty. Kind of makes it look like a lavascape. Bit of that, and then just gonna put some of the bits from the bottom of the oil as well. And there we go. Give it a little rest. Don't cut it yet because it'll be too liquid. So you want to sort of let it sit for like 10 to 20 minutes, depending on how patient you are. And also depending on like the thickness. I would probably, because this is quite a tall one, I'm gonna let it rest for a little bit longer and then eat. And here we go. Ooh, look at that. Damn. Ah, she's beautiful. Let's see what we've got here. I mean, I'm pretty sure I'm gonna like it because it's my favorite recipe, but let's see if it works in the US. Definitely works in the US. Yeah, that is really delicious. Prawny, It's hot, it's creamy. It's perfect, I think. So this is my prawn and habanero lasagna. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you'll cook the recipe. You can find the recipe at the link below or at food52.com, and please like and subscribe for more recipes.